Hello, in this video we're going to look at upstream and downstream monopolies. We have an upstream monopoly that produces output X at a marginal cost that is constant at $12. This upstream monopolist sells this output X at a per unit price of K to a downstream monopoly. The downstream monopoly uses output X to produce and sell good Y. The inverse demand for good Y is P equals 100 minus 2 times Y. We're going to assume 1 unit of good X creates 1 unit of good Y, and there are no other costs associated with producing good Y. We want to solve for K, X, P, and Y. So to sum up, the upstream monopolist produces output X at a constant marginal cost of $12 and sells it to a downstream monopolist at a price equal to K. The downstream monopolist produces good Y using this input X and produces good Y at a marginal cost equal to K, basically the price that the upstream monopolist sells this input to the downstream monopolist. The downstream monopolist sells this good to consumers, and the inverse demand is price equals 100 minus 2Y. So let's start with the downstream monopolist. We have the inverse demand for the downstream monopolist. From here we're going to get marginal revenue. And we'll just recall that marginal revenue is the inverse demand with a slope that is twice as steep. So instead of 100 minus 2y, it's 100 minus 4y. Slope is twice as steep, 2 times 2. We're going to set this marginal revenue equal to marginal cost for the downstream monopolist. The marginal cost for the downstream monopolist is the per unit price that the downstream monopolist pays for the input that comes from the upstream monopolist. So 100 minus 4y equals K. Let's solve this for Y. So dividing everything through by 4 and isolating Y, we get the following result. Now let's move to the upstream monopolist. The upstream monopolist understands how the downstream monopolist will behave. So since Y equals X, our assumption here is 1 unit of X produces 1 unit of Y, we can replace this Y with X. So X equals 25 minus 0.25 K. We want to solve this for K, and basically what we're getting here is the inverse demand for good X. This is from the upstream monopolist point of view. So solving this equation for K, moving some things around, dividing through by 0.25, K equals 100 minus 4x. And this is essentially the inverse demand for the upstream monopolist input that it will sell to the downstream monopolist. What we want to do here is get the marginal revenue. So marginal revenue is the inverse demand with a slope that is twice as steep, so 100 minus 8x. We're going to set this marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, which is assuming $12 here. And now we're going to solve for X. So 100 minus 12 is 88, and X will equal 11. So the upstream monopolist will produce and sell 11 units of good X to the downstream monopolist at the price of, just take this 11 here and plug it into the inverse demand, and that'll give us the input price, or K, of 100 minus 44, or $56. Okay, now we need to go back to the downstream monopolist. So again, just summarizing, the upstream firm sells 11 units of good X to the downstream firm at $56 per unit, so K equals 56. We have the downstream firm. We solved this equation earlier. And if we were to put in 56 here, it should be no surprise that Y equals 11. Remember, Y equals X. So when the downstream firm pays $56 for each input, it will buy 11 of those inputs. What will the downstream monopolist sell those inputs to consumers at, or sell the good Y to consumers at? 100 minus 2Y. Y is 11. So 100 minus 22. the price will be $78. Last thing I want to do is just talk about an integrated monopoly. Let's assume that the upstream firm and the downstream firm became just one giant monopoly instead of two separate monopolies. Would that be beneficial to consumers? Well, the marginal cost for this giant monopoly would be $12. The cost of producing the input X, which is required to produce 1 unit of Y. The inverse demand doesn't change. Marginal revenue is 100 minus 4Y. Setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Solving for Y. This giant monopolist would actually produce twice as much output compared to two separate monopolies, an upstream and downstream monopoly. And in terms of the market price, instead of $78, consumers now would only pay $56. So kind of the intuition what's going on here is that with one giant monopoly, we avoid the double markup problem. In the first scenario, we had the upstream monopolist marking up their product. Then they would sell it to the downstream monopolist, who then would mark up their product when they would sell it to consumers. So you had two markups going on. When you have just one giant monopoly, we just have one markup. So consumers pay less and they buy more. All right, that's it. I hope you found this video helpful.